Well, here we are, another pleasant early afternoon, mid-September. The sun's playing cat and mouse with the clouds, so there may be issues regarding the quality, but doesn't matter, does it really? Now, guilty. I plead guilty. I'm a baby boomer. Currently, there is a discussion in Australia and other parts of the world, to a lesser degree, regarding the role the baby boomers, and the baby boomers are those people who were born after World War II, the decade after World War II, have played in shaping the type of society we have, and the significant effect it is having on future generations. Now, I'm the first one to admit that the hopes and aspirations of this generation in their early and late 20s is very different to the reality in 2023. It reminds me of that old saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, there are some exceptionally important issues which has arisen because of the path taken by not all, but significant sections of the baby boomer generation, which is having a profoundly negative effect on society, an effect which will last if there is no major shift in policy and legislation and culture. Will have a profound impact for generations. In the 1960s and the 1970s, we saw change. Not change brought about by government, but change brought about by governments which were forced to legislate in order to accommodate the aspirations of a generation. But unfortunately, those aspirations were quickly turned on their head. What am I talking about? It's all very well talking in generalities. What am I talking about? Number one of the major difficulties that people have in this country today, young people who go on to take up the opportunity of a tertiary education, is debt. Student debt, HECS fees. The whole point of the struggle in the late 60s and 70s was to introduce free tertiary education in order to break the monopoly that only a small section of society was actually able to afford to have a tertiary education. And I'm a beneficiary of that policy. I never paid 1 cent for my medical degree and for my doctoral degree. Not 1 cent. But today, if somebody did the type of education I did, they would be saddled with debt for at least a decade. At least a decade, a debt which would be approaching $250,000. So that's the first thing that's happened, is that soon after free education was introduced, within 15 years, the Labor government, that's right, the Labor government, introduced fees, because as a society we made the decision that education, universal access to education, wasn't important, that everybody had to pay for the privilege. And obviously what that meant is that the old criteria is held. Those whose parents could afford to pay for that education graduated debt-free, and those who couldn't spend the next 10 to 15 years of their lives paying off that debt. So that's the first negative. What's the next negative? A lot of the culture around the boomer generation is about individuals, individual rights, individual opportunities. We forgot, as a generation, what we benefited from was cooperative action. People combining, not only to form trade and labour councils and trade unions, but people combining to promote various issues in the community, issues regarding Indigenous rights, issues regarding women's rights, issues regarding disability rights. And that combining meant cooperation. But to a significant degree, the boomer generation, it was about competition, individual gain, individual profit, individual rights. Not about the fact that we are all part and parcel of a community and a society, a region, a town, a city, a state, a nation, a combination of sovereign nation states and planet Earth. So we forgot that the glue that held society together, which ensured that any change which occurred benefited a significant section of a population, not just a small section, was cooperation. And we've seen the baby boomer generation that has been able to acquire power, because most of the people who are now in positions of authority and power are baby boomers, have gone back on that cooperative principles, especially when the rights of working people to withdraw their labour is concerned, the rights for people to freely associate and combine to improve their situation, whether it's at the workplace or somewhere else. And we've seen this individuality crush a sense of community. And we wonder why people don't join political parties or volunteer groups or political movements. And while most people, we wonder why most people are involved in individual activities and refuse point blank to combine. We have this culture that struggles against cooperation, that puts competition before everything else. The other thing we've seen as far as the cooperative aspects of society are concerned is legislation which has removed the ability of the state to look after the interests of people. Legislation which has seen the privatisation of services which provide essential services to the community. And we've seen the privatisation monster destroy many aspects of the health service, public health service, public education, public roads. We've seen the introduction of toll roads. We've seen billions of dollars of taxpayers' money going to private education. We see $6 to $8 billion every year subsidise a private health insurance system which can't even provide for the basic necessities of most people who find themselves who need health care in the private sector. So we've seen a change of culture. A culture which is tied in to that individuality, that preeminence of the individual and their needs above the preeminence of the group of society. And we've seen that philosophy filter through to all aspects of our everyday life. And this, to a significant degree, is due to that culture, that political culture, that social culture that has been created, which is based on a private investment for private profit model. So, as a baby boomer, most of us are guilty. There are those of us who are tempted to expand a different vision, but we have been singularly unsuccessful in challenging the economic juggernaut, in challenging the privatisation model, the deregulation model, the globalisation model, the corporatisation model, which has become part and parcel of everyday existence in Australia today. The housing sector is a classical example of what happens when you change a right in terms of shelter into an investment vehicle. In the 1960s, a single person in the workforce in a family unit earning an average wage could buy a house on a quarter-acre block within 7 years. Today, we have intergenerational mortgages. That's right, intergenerational mortgages. When people die, they leave their mortgage to their children. And obviously, although there's been winners in this mechanism of making private residences an investment vehicle, though there have been winners, the fact is that although the baby boomers have been winners, because most of us have been in, not all, but most of us have been in a position to actually buy a home and pay off that home before we die, because of escalating housing values. We've seen that escalation create a residential, but that gain, as far as increasing residential property is concerned, is to a significant degree been illusory. Although we can sell that asset, we find that as we grow older, the fact that you have to pay, if you're a boomer, many boomers pay private health insurance. We find that failing health and increasing fragility means that people need accommodation in the aged care sector. We find that the aged care sector has become privatised. And unlike in the past, when you benefited through cooperative efforts and through publicly owned aged care institutions or not-for-profit aged care institutions, what we see that most of that illusory money that has been gained through holding onto property until people are much older in the baby boomer generation disappears in terms of health costs, in terms of aged care costs, and in terms of having to pay for your own old age through a superannuation system, which is designed to free the state of the burden of looking after the interests of its elderly. So it's no wonder we find that young people have to saddle themselves with mortgages which are 10 times, 15 times more than baby boomers did when they bought a house with the help of the banks. And it's all very well to talk about high interest rates in the past, but the fact is that the mortgage that had to be serviced was much, much, much lower. Not only have we created a situation for allowing residential housing to become a investment vehicle, and for allowing state governments to destroy the public housing sector, which provided housing security for people who couldn't buy in the private residential market. What we have created is a monster. And this monster, this burden, is not carried by those who have disposable income. It is not carried by those with investment properties. It is carried by the children of the baby boomers who have allowed this situation to occur. And now we find the same group, significant segments, not all, but significant segments of the same group, fighting tooth and nail to retain those little resources they have, forgetting about the future of their children and grandchildren. Realising, in many regards too late, that we have allowed this situation to occur. Not just in terms of economics, not just in terms of access to health, access to education, not just in terms of creating a more divisive, combative, aspirational, competitive mentality and culture and society, but in terms of putting the very planet at risk through greenhouse emissions, which to a significant degree is directly related to the private investment for private profit mantra. Whether that private investment for private profit mantra is held in the hands of unaccountable corporations or states with a centralised economy, whether it's state-based capitalism or private capitalism, the fact is, at the end of the day, it is capitalism. So we have now facing extraordinary problems because as a generation, as the post-war generation, we have been too intent on satisfying our own individual needs. We have been too intent on accepting and promoting and legislating ideologies and philosophies which are based on the creation of ever-increasing profits, irrespective of the human, social, environmental concerns. We are now paying the price for not having the vision to understand the struggles which had preceded us for hundreds of years before us, which created a public sector, which created a cooperative atmosphere, which allowed trade unions to grow to represent workers' interests, to allow people to access healthcare, education, the environment, recreation, irrespective of their disposable income. The fact that we have jettisoned these ideas have now created this monster that we now face. And that division between generations is real. And the tragedy is that in many regards, what has happened is we have returned to the 18th century, the 19th century, where those with disposable income and their offspring enjoyed the fruits of the world, while the rest pricked up the crumbs. For far too long, we have believed that we can prosper and survive by the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table, that are brushed off the state table. The reality is much more different. And until we learn that the only way that we can go forward is to cut one of the legs of that table so that the common resources which are held by all of us are shared by all of us, that we begin to reinvent the cooperative sector, that we again reinvent public assets to provide for basic human needs, we'll find ourselves in the same situation. Green energy or no green energy. If it continues to be centralised, if it continues to be privately owned, nothing will ultimately change. It's up to you. If you are part of the baby boomer generation, you can make amends. Not just by ensuring what's left of your estate goes to your offspring, but by ensuring that you become involved in the struggles around us to bring back universal values, to bring back public facilities, to bring back hope that change is not only theoretically possible, but practically possible.